All right, let's get our Bibles out tonight. We're going to start in, we're going to start and stop in Genesis chapter 31. We'll continue our in-depth study through this book. We're going to join Jacob, and we will be with him for several more weeks. These are I'm developing my testimony years, which means he's not doing all that well yet. We have been with Jacob since his birth, with his twin brother Esau. They were born in 2009 BC. And we really don't know much about them other than their parents had been 40 years old when they got married, Isaac and Rebekah. They prayed for 20 years to have kids. She was not able to have them. And yet the Lord graciously answered her prayers. But along with the prayer came a direction that the one born second, not the firstborn, but the secondborn, would get all of the honor of the firstborn. God had chosen through Jacob to continue that lineage to his son. And so we aren't told much else about that other than the parents were informed of that. And we really don't have anything to talk about until we get to chapter 25, where Esau is a guy who likes to be outside, and he's a cook, and he likes to eat. And so he came in from hunting, was hungry, and Jacob had made a pot of red bean stew, and he wanted something for it. And Jacob, clever guy as he was, said, "I'll sell it to you for your birthright." Well, God had already promised it to him, but if you're not walking with the Lord and trusting Him, Jacob wasn't interested in the spiritual benefits, or what would come out of that. He was interested in the power and the wealth that it would provide for him. And so that's all really we're told until we get to chapter 27, where we get a look at, for a long period of time, at this very dysfunctional family. The unspiritual father, Isaac, who knows very well what the Lord wants, yet wants to bless his favorite son, Isaac. Lots of favoritism. He thinks he's going to die. He's not. He will live for years to come. But needless to say, before he's going to die, he thinks he wants to bless his boy, even though God has told him otherwise. There is Rebekah, his wife, Jacob's mother and Esau's mother, who hears what the plot is, as Isaac sends his boy out to, "Hey, go cook some of that stew up for me, and then I'll bless you when you're done." But she hears about it, talks to Jacob, says, "Let's dress you up like your brother. I'll make the stew. You fool your dad. We'll get that blessing the way God intended, They're going to help the Lord out, if you will. And it works, or it worked for a while. It worked out. A couple of things as a result of that long tragedy that you read there in chapter 28 is Jacob played along, but he was only worried about getting caught. Esau just came back mad when he found out what had happened. The only person who really benefited from it was Isaac, who realized that he had been fooled into blessing Jacob, which is exactly what God wanted, but he saw it not as a deception from his wife. He saw it as a hand of the Lord getting what the Lord wanted all along. And so he said, "I'm just going to leave it like that." And the mention of Isaac in Hebrews 11 was that he was willing to acquiesce to what he knew the Lord's will was, even though he tried very hard to deny it or to stand against it, if you will. But as a result of this fooling, Esau said, "I'm going to kill you as soon as Dad's dead, and we're done grieving. You're dead." Mama hears about it, and she believes that that's the case, and she talks her husband into sending Jacob to her brother's house, some 500 miles away, kind of where Abraham came from, her brother named Laban. Now, to be honest with you, her argument was, well, if we leave Jacob here, he'll marry some unbelieving wives like our other son, has done, her favorite son, Jacob. Anyway, Dad agrees to it. She said it'll only be for a few years. Jacob ended up leaving for 20. So by the time he gets to moving towards home, which is what we're going to read about tonight, he's now 100, or no, he's now 98 years old. On the other hand, he arrives to Laban's house in Paddan Aram. It is today in northern Iraq, and near the place, like I said, where Abraham had called upon the Lord to leave behind everything he had and to come to the land of promise. Jacob ran 40 miles that first night. He was upset, maybe fearful. He was 78 years old. What are you going to do? Fell asleep on a rock in a place called Luz, an almond tree. But the Lord gave him a dream. He was exhausted. You don't sleep on a rock very well. The Lord gave him a vision of this ladder that went from the heavens to the earth, and the angels were going up and down upon it. And Jacob woke up and said, the Lord's here. I didn't know it, but the Lord is here. Called the name of the place Bethel, house of God. God made him a promise that he would be with him, that he would bring him back to this place. Jacob kind of bargaining, not really bargaining, but agreeing. So, well, Lord, if you'll do that, I'll serve you all the days of my life. But that wasn't really time for that yet. Jacob had made a promise, but he certainly wasn't following through. When you get to chapter 30, we have the story last week of Jacob's time for those 20 years in Laban's house, if you will. Jacob met a beautiful younger daughter that he had named Rachel, wanted to marry her. She had an older sister named Leah, who was maybe not as attractive, I don't know, but she's certainly the older one. And Jacob was just drawn to her. He said, what can I pay you for a dowry? I don't have any money, but I'll work it off. And he said, you can work for 7 years. You can have her as a wife. And he did with joy. Found out on his wedding night in the morning that they'd slipped in Leah, not Rachel, and he was more than a little upset. He went and said, hey, what are you doing? He goes, oh, we honor the rights of the firstborn here, and she's firstborn. And so they made another deal that he would work 7 more years for Rachel as well. I think it does look like he married both of them as well. And all this favoritism that Jacob had grown up with at home is now carried into his life. He likes Rachel better than he likes Leah. He favors her, and he's more interested in her. As a result, in chapter 30, when all of these children are being born, it is always a result of competition. I want to have kids so that I'll be better than you. Leah wanted the love of her husband. Rachel just wanted to win the argument. She'd never lost one of those in her life. You know, she won all the beauty contests, I guess. And so there was all of this striving. It ended up involving their 2 handmaidens, Bilhah and Zilpah. But through those 4 women, Jacob now married, would come forth all of the 12 sons of Israel, so to speak, that would become the nation. And it was born out of competition and superstition and struggle. And you can just imagine how all of this looked. In fact, you know, this dysfunctional family that Jacob had, you know, we found the competition for the love of a husband, the selling of superstitions for fertility through these mandrakes that were supposed to be powerful, the seeking of wealth through throwing strips of bark into a feeding trough to decide livestock births, but through it all, you know, there is this awful kind of spiritually destitute lifestyle from a man who knows the Lord, but yet isn't walking with the Lord at all. And like the stealing of the birthright, one of the lessons you have to walk away from as you read through these texts is God will get his way no matter what. You know, you can connive and hustle and blame others, but the Lord will work out a way that he'll get what he wants. You'll still be responsible for your choices, but no way will this turn out not the way God wants. God's in charge. He's good. He knows what he's doing. And it's certainly one of those big lessons that you stamp over these in-depth kind of looks at home life and the way that all of these things transpired. Discovering the will of God requires us to be able to wait upon the Lord, not to help him out, not to have the old ends justify me, this is what the Lord wanted, but to just rest. And I think if you're able to ask Jacob or Rebecca this now, they would tell you that. Let God work it out, for sure. The will of God will always come to pass. Either you'll be blessed waiting upon him to do it, or you'll be hurt seeking to help him along. You don't need to do that. Well, we get to chapter 31 tonight. It is 1911 BC. Jacob is 98 years old. He has served Laban for 14 years as a dowry for 2 daughters, seeing the blessings of God upon Jacob, though Jacob rarely seemed to acknowledge it, although he will tonight. Laban wants Jacob to say he sees him not as a blessing from God, but just, you know, a lucky rabbit's foot, so to speak. Your God's blessing you. Hey, I just want you to be around. Didn't want anything to do with his God, just from the benefit that it will come. And so he begins to talk Jacob into staying, offers him whatever he wants. And Jacob basically signs on for 20 more years. But the Lord prospered Jacob, blessed him. His hand was upon him. And now he's 20 years in. He's 98 years old. It's 1911 BC. And he's ready to head home and away from this terrible place that, well, terrible in the sense of he's been hustled and he's been the hustler. And It's the place Abraham had been called out of. It wasn't a place God wanted him to stay. And again, all these circumstances work together. You can look at the human side, but never lose track of the divine side. God wanted Jacob to go home. He said to him 20 years earlier, I'll bring you back here to this place. I'll be with you. I'll keep you safe. I'll provide for you. And so this journey and this work of God together will be our study tonight and next week as well, as Jacob, the patriarch, heads home with 11 sons and a daughter, and we'll have another son a little bit later, Benjamin, which will become the 12th tribe of Israel. We haven't read, if you've been with us regularly, much about Jacob's spiritual life these last 20 years. There's really no information to be found except for his meeting with the Lord 20 years earlier when he had left and he stopped at Bethel back in chapter 28. He's heading at least back in the right direction. Will he get there? I hate to spoil it for you, but no, it's going to be 8 more years before he finally ends up saying to the Lord, all right, have it your way. By then, he's 106. So if you've been hanging out away from the Lord and you're 45 years old today, hey, come on, man, you can beat Jacob by 60 years. Get back there where you belong. But that'll be our lessons for the next couple of weeks. Tonight, these 55 verses have enough, I think, lessons for us to spend our time in this one chapter. So let's begin in chapter 31, verse 1, where we read these things. And we should say we ended up with Jacob being prospered by the Lord in all that he was doing. And so Jacob hears the word now. Jacob hears the words of Laban's sons. And they said, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and now what was our father's, he has acquired all of his wealth. And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, and indeed it was not favorable towards him as before. For the last 6 years, Jacob had been working the farms. He had been watching over the flocks. He had been tending to the growth, if you will, the wealth and the future inheritance of the boys, but everything he touched seemed to turn to gold. Now, we mentioned last week he tried a bunch of animal husbandry things that some people, he was well ahead of his time. No, I think it was mostly superstition. It's all that you really find in this land. But at the same time, God's hand was certainly upon Jacob, and Jacob started to gather more than Laban, and everything seemed to turn his way. So it didn't take a genius to look and recognize the faces of the boys and Laban, not any longer very friendly like they were when Jacob was making them a lot of money. Now their looks were more menacing. Their body language was changed. Their words seemed to send different signals, their tone and their posture and the rigidity of their expressions, things that you saw, and Jacob saw it too. For the last 20 years, these men had been jockeying for position. It's like the old survival, the old outwit and outplay and outlast. Pretty much Jacob was winning, if you will. So there was a tension that they were able to live with for 20 years, but now it was just going to come apart. So friction. And notice that Laban's sons were very jealous of Jacob's success. God had been blessing Jacob. Laban had admitted that 20 years, or I should say 6 years earlier in chapter 30. He asked him to stay, but now things had turned, if you will. Jacob sensed that it had come time to leave. Here's how he figured that out. He looked at their faces. They weren't so welcoming. Jeremiah was a young man when the Lord called him to go and bear his word to the people, young guy. And the message that the Lord gave to Jeremiah was a very difficult one that you wouldn't want to really deliver unless you had to. It was a word of correction and judgment to come. And Jeremiah tried to argue that he was just a young guy. I don't want to do this. My youth will become a hindrance. And the Lord said, don't you be afraid of their faces. I'm with you. So here's Jacob looking at their faces. And he's moved. And he realizes it. As a pastor these many years, it's an interesting view from this side of the pulpit. Sometimes you see people that are bored to tears. And you look at them and just, okay. And you think, I should probably stop. This guy, he's going to die. Sometimes people look with very serious confrontational kind of concentration. Other people are asleep. Some doubt, some challenge. Some are extremely happy to be here. I found a few of you that are extremely happy to be here. Some are receptive and smiling. I always look for those faces. Yet, if you're going to be a pastor and teach God's word, you just have to please one person. That's the Lord. He's the one I'm going to have to answer to for everything that comes out of my mouth standing before a congregation. It's his word I'm supposed to represent. It's his ability to open the eyes of the blind. It's his promise that his word doesn't go out void. He tells me this word that we teach can convert a soul, that it can feed the heart and convict of sin and light our paths. So you can't be moved by what you see, but it is certainly sometimes challenging because faces kind of reveal the heart. When Cain was so angry with the Lord and his brother because his offering was rejected, it said that his countenance fell. When Samson's parents got that visit from the angel of the Lord and God began to speak to him, she went to her husband and said, I ran into a man of God. His countenance was like that of an angel. I couldn't but be moved by what I saw. It interests me to note how God has a way of preparing us. Notice in verse 3 that we get Jacob's perspective, if you will, in verses 1 and 2. But verse 3 says, Then the Lord said to Jacob, I want you to return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I'll be with you. How does God prepare us to move? I think we all like daily routine. I know sometimes when we're away, speaking somewhere, even on vacation, after a couple of weeks, you just go, I want to go home and just sleep in my own bed and sit on my couch and do what I do every day. We complain about routine until we don't have it anymore, and then we wish we could go back to it. Jacob could have settled here. But I would remind you that 6 years earlier, he had an itch to go home. He desired to go home. It was only the prospect of gain and getting the upper hand over an uncle that had hustled him as well, that had changed his wages, that kept him here. He stayed, not because the Lord had told him to stay, but because he wanted some bit of vengeance or equality, if you will. Yet now things were not as comfortable. The pressure was being applied. Jacob was being stirred. Home looked a lot better. There was an older and maybe an even steamier brother waiting for him. That's the last time he'd heard he wanted to kill him as well. So what does he do? He's stirred. He looks at the faces, and the Lord says to him, go home. Here's a principle that you can apply a lot. You can find it in scriptures constantly in terms of how does God make his way clear to his people, and how do we determine his will or discern it. And the single most obvious point that starts God's leading is it usually begins with a desire of the heart. In other words, you begin to desire something that's different from everybody else. That God begins in you, right? The Lord has to begin a work in you. If you go back and read verses, I think 25 and 26 of last week, he said to Laban, I want to go home. I take my kids, my wives. I've been faithful. I've had enough of being here. The process of God's work always begins with an inner desire. Always with an inner desire. Delight yourself in the Lord. He will give you the desires of your heart. So you want God to lead you. Be attentive to what God is doing inside your heart. That doesn't mean God's going to give you what you want. That's really not what the lesson would be. It's really a matter of God, as you wait upon him, begins to form in you the desires he wants for you. Maybe the best example I can give you, I have a friend who is a missionary in Iran. Nobody can know. You can't write him by email. He sneaks around. He puts radio transmitters with the gospel in them and hides them in cities, and they run for 3 or 4 weeks, and they reach about 8 miles, and then they die. Been doing it for years. I have no desire to visit him. I love him, pray for him, love when I get notes from him. I don't want to go. I think Dan Fringfrog, one of our missionaries, called me right before the pandemic started. He goes, hey, you want to go with me? I get to go teach in Iran. I went, no. And he said, do you want to pray about it first? I said, all right. No. I just had no desire. He couldn't get away from that desire because God had stirred in his heart this desire to go. Whether, the mission field is oftentimes a real good illustration of how that works because, sometimes we can be moved in 100 directions. But if you're wanting to go to Iran and hide yourself so they don't catch you and kill you, that's a calling. And you probably don't share that, but maybe if you do, well, then you'll know what maybe the Lord is doing with you. So desire is first. Second of all, and you can find it in the two verses here with what we started, there has to go along with that desire a verification or a confirmation that the Lord is doing this, and it is usually discovered in circumstances, the things that go on around you. Number one, Jacob wanted to go home, but he had made a deal to stay, even though it was really for the wrong reason. Number two, that place became a very uncomfortable place for him to stay. We'll use the missionary example again. If, you are a housewife, and let's say you have, 10 children. God bless you. And you say to me, I want to be a full-time missionary in Africa. I might say, I think you've got that work cut out for you at home. So the desire might be there. There might be a heart for missions. But let's face it, the circumstances make that a very questionable calling. You can get involved in a lot of things. You can join the prayer teams. You write and raise support. You can send folks, or be a contact person. But until you find that the circumstances can stand alongside the desire, you really don't know whether the Lord is moving you or not. But here are the circumstances in Jacob's life supported the desire. Things had turned sour, unfavorable. There was friction. What I desire in my heart is confirmed by the circumstances in which I face. Thirdly, verse 3, you should hear from the Lord. A clear direction through his word, however God would speak to your heart. The first two will make that third one, I think, easier. Notice the words in verse 3, then the Lord spoke. When the desire was established, even though it was set aside for a while for sinful purposes, when the situation began to be supportive of the desire to leave, then the Lord speaks. That's step 3. Then the Lord speaks to confirm what the heartfelt desires of Jacob's heart and the circumstances were leading. And he says this, go home, return to the land of your fathers, to your family. I'll go with you. It's 500 miles. He's got a bunch of kids and a wealth that can't hardly be numbered. He's going to take weeks and months to travel 400 or 500 miles. This is not going to be an easy situation or a very safe one. But the Lord clearly spoke to him. Rather than bemoaning the circumstances, Jacob looked for God's hands, heard his word, and was able to move from one place to another. So with that, obviously, prayer becomes an integral part. Lead me, O Lord, make your way straight before my face. What is that, Psalm 5? Right? Make your way straight before my face. So God will either, by removing the conviction of your heart, stop you from going, or he will rearrange the circumstances that will block your way, or tell you the timing isn't yet, or he will deepen that desire from within that we will eventually just begin to move. The humble, he teaches his way. Trust in him. Commit your way to him. He'll bring it to pass. So at least in Jacob, because we see a man that, I was going to say young, but he's not young, a man who has spent years, though he knew the Lord, not really walking with the Lord. This is kind of his come around to Jesus kind of movement in the Old Testament. It's going to take a while, but God is beginning to work with him. So the fourth step, and the last step I'll tell you in that little scenario is ask people you trust. Share your vision with others as they pray for you. Let them be an encouragement to you. See what the Lord would tell you through others who you look up to, which we find here in these next few verses. So verse 4, We'll get through this, don't worry. I know we're only in verse 4. So Jacob sent, and he called Rachel, and he called Leah out to the fields, to the flocks, and he said to them, I see that your father's countenance is not favorable towards me as before. And listen to these words, but the Lord, but the God of my fathers has been with me. That's a brilliant insight that Jacob hasn't really acknowledged over the last 20 years of us reading about him. You know that with all of my might I have served your father. He's deceived me, he's changed my wages 10 times. And again, but God did not allow him to hurt me. If he said this, or thus, the speckled shall be your wages, then all of the flocks bore speckled. And if he said thus, the streak shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaks. Again with the Lord, so God has taken away the livestock of your father, and he has given them to me. Jacob 3 times acknowledges the Lord's actions in his life. All, to say to us, he's coming around. That's more we've heard him talk about the Lord than in the first 90 years of his life. And it happened, verse 10, at the time when the flocks conceived, that I lifted up my eyes, and I saw in a dream, and behold, the rams were leaped upon the flocks. They were streaked and speckled and gray spotted. And the angel of the Lord came to me in a dream and said, Jacob, and I said, here I am. He said, lift up now your eyes and see all of the rams which leap in the fields, that they're streaked and speckled and gray spotted, for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. And I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and where you made your vow to me. Now arise, get out of this land, and return to the land of your family. Jacob acknowledges God's blessing, and he lays to rest this idea that somehow he was good at manipulating food. I've done this. God has put his hand upon this. But notice in this tough place of difficulty, Jacob had learned or was learning to trust the Lord, and his own devices are beginning to be laid down. Not completely, but certainly in many ways he was beginning to see that God's hand was upon him, that these things didn't just happen in a vacuum or just lucky breaks. In his plans to know God's will, we read this idea of him going now to his wives, to his family, and those who, as he keeps the flocks, and he says to them, here's how we've lived these last 6 years. He was probably in the west by the road leading out of there. He gives his wives the facts as he knows them about his father Laban. He gives them the testimony of God speaking to his heart, telling him the blessings that he had brought upon him these many years, how that he had made a covenant with God at that place he called Bethel 20 years earlier, how that God had kept his word, had kept him, and he felt that now I have to go obey him. You might say, well, he's just running out of fear. Well, that's true. It certainly was a component. But what motivated him was certainly a willingness to listen to the Lord. And it makes that quite clear, The faces just helped him make the choice. There was a desire in the Lord. There was circumstances that were, moving that along. And so he told his wives what was going on. Well, then in verse 14, Rachel and Leah, his wives, answered and said, is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not considered strangers to him? He has sold us and also completely consumed our money. For all these riches which God had taken from our father are really ours and our children's. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do it. So the girls agreed that their father had wasted their dowry, which, by the way, Jacob paid for 14 years of dowry. That was supposed to be for the girls, right? That was for their lives, and if anything should happen to Jacob, it belonged to them, but Dad had spent it. The piggy bank was empty. He'd showed them little fatherly love. God had kept them, but only so. Jacob was there. And I love verse 16, because their advice to their husband is, you do whatever God tells you. Whatever God has said to you, you should go do it. So here's this confirmation from others, right? Now we have all of those 4 steps, if you will, in place. A desire, a confirmation in the circumstances. He's heard from the Lord directly in a vision. God has been speaking to him. He feels motivated to serve the Lord. He realizes the blessings. And then his wives said to him, let's do what God tells us, which was a big step for them. So we read in verse 17, Jacob got up and his sons and his wives on camels, and he carried away all of his livestock, his possessions which he'd gained, his acquired livestock which he had gained there in Paddan Aram, to go to his father Isaac, living in the land of Canaan, the promised land. Now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the household idols that were her dad's. And Jacob stole away, unbeknownst to Laban the Syrian, and that he did not tell him that he intended to flee. And so he fled with all that he had. He arose, he crossed the river, and he headed towards the mountains of Gilead. So Jacob, because Jacob's still Jacob, is out on the big escape, right? He's separated from Laban's camp by many miles because they were supposed to be grazing separately. And he had servants and children and wives and livestock. And Jacob does what Jacob does. Jacob runs. Jacob's a runner, at least up until now. That's his MO. He does so out of fear. Notice verse 20, he steals away, just saying, well, let's just leave. There's no sense telling what we're going to do. A couple of things. Verse 17, I don't know if you've ever ridden a camel. They're miserable to sit on. I know it looks cute on a picture, but they're horrible. To ride for 20 steps is a pain. This is almost 500 miles. I think that would have been enough for me to stay with him forever, but I can only imagine. And then we have this picture of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel, stealing her dad's household idols. The Hebrew word is teraphim. Little statues that the people kept in their houses to seek the will of God, sometimes, signifying the holder had the rights of the firstborn. They were used for a lot of different purposes, but none of them godly. In any event, for now, Rachel reflects more on the idolatry of her father than she's even drawn to the faith of her husband. So Jacob hasn't had a tremendously good influence on his family. Jacob knew there was only one God, and now he's beginning to wake up, if you will, to God's goodness. She, at this point in her life, still believed that the will of God's and the influence of idolatry could change her life. And so she leans into her father's religious ways, if you will, rather than Jacob's knowledge of his God. I can't think of anything more foolish. That Psalm 115 that talks about, idols they have mouths, but they can't speak, and eyes they have, and they can't see, and ears, but they can't walk anywhere. Who wants to serve something that's that powerless? How can that be a God to anyone? My mother, before she was saved, used to put these little statues in her car, be Catholic. We had St. Christopher for a long time until he was demoted by I forget who. And then he was on a comeback. I think he came back after we were saved. Or she'd put Mother Mary up on the dashboard, held by a magnet. And I remember even as a kid, being a smart aleck, I would say to my mom, could you at least turn her around so she could see where we're going? Because looking at me is not going to... And then my mother would just get so angry. You don't talk like, in any event. So Rachel's got a few of those hidden in her pocket because, she wants to be sure she's covering all the bases. But much like her husband, that devotion isn't very strong yet. So they get a 3-day head start. They cross the Euphrates River. They head through the Fertile Crescent on the way to the hills of Gilead, which is kind of north and east of the land of promise. But like I said, the progress has to be just slow. And it does seem, just from what we're told, he might have made 20 miles a day. At least part of that. There could have been, cattle for mouths. But needless to say, he made a pretty good move to get to Gilead. So we read in verse 22, Laban was told on the 3rd day after Jacob left that he was gone. And he took his brethren with him. He pursued him for 7 days' journey. So now he's 10 days out. And he overtakes him in the mountains of Gilead. But God had came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night and said to him, be careful that you not speak to Jacob either good or bad. And so Laban overtook Jacob, and Jacob had pitched his tent in the mountains, and Laban with his brethren had pitched themselves in the mountains of Gilead as well. So Jacob at least where he was camped, 10 days later finds himself almost 200 miles from where he started. The household idols, teraphim taken by Rachel from her father's house, maybe to make finding her more difficult in any event. She's got those with her. On day 10, we are told Laban saw the encampment of Jacob, planned in the morning to take him out, but it appears that the Lord the night before came to him and said, "Slow down. That's my boy. And don't you speak to him either good or evil." And the fear of the Lord seemed to be instilled that he leave him alone. So Laban obeys because Jacob's God is powerful, though he doesn't know him. Doesn't obey out of repentance, doesn't obey out of, just a joy to obey. He's not interested in Jacob's God. He's interested in murdering this kid of 100. He's steamed. So we read in verse 26 that Jacob and Laban then meet that morning, and he says, "What have you done that you have stolen away, unknowns to me, carried away my daughters like captives taken by the sword? Why did you flee away secretly and steal away from me and not tell me, so I might have sent you away with joy and songs and a timbrel and a harp?" Like that was going to happen. Laban begins by accusing Jacob of stealing away unbeknownst to him, which, by the way, is exactly what he did. Kidnapping his daughters, well, they were his wives, not exactly kidnapping. And then saying, "Hey, if you'd have told me, I'd have, with a great joy, we'd had a big bon voyage party and high fives all around, balloons." But you remember what his daughter said about him. He was a horrible guy. He goes on in verse 28 and says, "You did not allow me to kiss my sons and my daughters, so now you have done foolishly in so doing. It is in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, 'Be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad.' And now you have surely gone because you greatly long for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods? You've deprived me of my love of my children. It's such a foolish thing to do. I could hurt you." That's a typical bully words, aren't they? Well, go ahead and try. "But the God of your father spoke to me last night and warned me not to do so at all." So then he says to him, "Maybe you just did this because you're homesick. That's fine. But why do you steal my gods in the process?" Now, I never can get over these verses when people go, "You stole my gods. Where's my lucky rabbit's foot? I lost my lucky charm. Where's my horseshoe?" Really? It's kind of like the response of Gideon's dad. When Gideon obeyed the Lord, one of the things he did was go into town and destroy the temple of Baal. But his dad was kind of a big shot in town, and so when they woke up in the morning, they realized Gideon had done this. The Lord had sent him. And they came to his dad and said, "We need him. We're going to string him up. He destroyed our place of worship." They wanted to kill us all. And Dad kind of got the realization of what was going on. And he said to the men at the door, "Look, if Baal is really a god, let him fight for himself. You don't need our help. You don't have to string up. Let the God go get him." So these little wooden or probably stone images, they couldn't yell. They were in the saddlebag. They could, "Hey, we're in here." Okay, maybe that was some kind of God. Nothing. They couldn't. They can't watch you. They can't keep you. They can't meet your needs. They can't deliver you. They can't even keep themselves from being stolen. This is not God, just so you know. It's like when I hear these guys on the radio trying to raise money to do God's work. Hey, God can pay his bills. And if you got to work that hard to finance your God, maybe that's not the God you should be serving. Well, anyway, Jacob, responds and he says, honestly, I left because I was afraid, which is probably honest. I mean, he did believe this was going to be difficult. "For I said, perhaps you would take your daughters from me by force. With whomever you find your gods," when it comes to that, "don't let them live. In the presence of your brethren, identify what I have of yours and take it with you." For Jacob didn't know that his wife, Rachel, had stolen them. And so Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent, into the two maids' tents. He couldn't find anything. When he came to out of Leah's tent, he went into Rachel's tent, but Rachel had taken the household idols. She had put them in the camel's saddle, and then she sat down upon them. As Laban was searching the tent, he didn't find anything, and she said to her dad, "If it not displease my lord, I can't get up. I'm in the manner of woman that is with me." And so he searched but didn't find the idols. So Jacob was angry. "Okay, I'm afraid you're going to cause us trouble. When it comes to stealing your God, we don't have. In fact, kill whoever you find with them here." And he invites Laban to search thoroughly, declares capital punishment for the thief. And I suspect Laban tossed this place. I'm sure stuff went flying in every direction, didn't find anything, turns away by the lies of Rachel, because this family is good at lying, and so is Jacob. And Jacob watches, and as Jacob watches, it's kind of like 20 years of repressed anger boils over. His stuff's being thrown around, his family's being accused. He's pretty sure he's been honest. "I was afraid of you, but we don't have your gods." And so what you read next is Jacob like blowing up. I think, here goes, ruins his witness and everything else. He just had enough. So he says in verse 36, or we read, "And Jacob was angry, and he rebuked Laban." The word anger here is the Hebrew word for burning, and the word rebuke is the Hebrew word for tearing someone apart. So I think he flew off the handle here. And he said to Laban, "What is my trespass, and what is my sin, that you have so hotly pursued me? Although you have searched all of my things, what part of your household things have you found? Set it here before your brethren and my brethren and your brethren, that we might judge between us both." What do you have? What did you tear up? Where is it? Let's get it over with. Where is it? Yeah, you got nothing. "These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried their young. I have not eaten the grams of your flock. That which was torn by beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it. You required it from my hand, whether it was stolen by day or stolen by night. There I was. In the day the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and sleep departed from my eyes. Thus I have been in your house for 20 years. I served 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and now you've changed my wages 10 times. This is just like you. It's been like this for 20 years. I cared for your property, didn't file claims for the losses, took the loss of the wild animals and the thieves on the chin. Could have brought you the body parts and the blood laying out in the side, but I didn't do that. I didn't eat the meat. I cost you nothing, took good care of you. This has been going on for 20 years. I've been wiped out. I suffered through droughts, suffered through frost, lost sleep, worked 14 years for your daughter, six more for your flocks. And this is the third time, by the way, that you've changed my wages 10 times. That must have been a sore spot with Jacob. He keeps reminding himself of that. So he ends the tirade in verse 42, and he says, "Unless the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been with me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my affliction and the labor of my hands, and he rebuked you even last night." He tore you up. He shut you up last night. So only by God's help. And again, you get this insight into this guy who's coming around, right? He's starting to see who the Lord is in his life. Now, Jacob does fly off the handle here a little bit, certainly. He doesn't have all of the story. Like, for example, he didn't know his wife was sitting on the idols, which is a good lesson, I guess, not to go off and shut your mouth off before you have all of the information. A lot of times you don't. But I think what maybe made Jacob the most angry was now with his new revelation of who the Lord is, I think he saw himself in Laban. I think he was yelling at himself more than anybody else. He hated what he saw. Well, there's not much Laban could have said at this point because everything he said was true. So, verse 43, Laban answers Jacob and said, "Well, these daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children, and this flock is my flock. All that you see is mine. But what can I do this day to these my daughters, or to this children whom they have borne? Now therefore, come, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. And so Jacob took a stone, set up a pillar, and Jacob said to his brethren, just gather the stones. And they gathered stones, and they made a heap, and they ate there upon the heap. And Laban called the place Gerhar Jahastuphu, I don't know. And Jacob called it Gilead, much easier. And Laban said, this heap will be a witness between you and me this day. Therefore the name is called Gilead, and also Mizpah, because he said, the Lord watch between me and you when we are absent one from another. So Laban, like I said, couldn't answer, so he does the dumb stuff. He starts claiming everything belongs to him, the flocks, the kids, the grandkids. Those are mine, but what can I do? So I'll tell you what, why don't we make an oath right here, and to be rid of him for good, realizing there was nothing he could do except, kind of separate himself. So we get to these few verses, and they make a deal. They build a mound of rocks. They eat together, and they make a covenant. They swear together, if you will. I know that, at least from verse 47, I just conclude that Hebrew must be easier than Aramaic, because this is the only Aramaic word found in the entire first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. The word Gilead and this Jagar, whatever you pronounce that last portion of, both mean witness. They both mean witness. One, obviously, in Hebrew, Gilead is Hebrew. The other is Aramaic. But this was not going to be some word of blessing. This was going to be a malediction rather than a benediction. This was a hatred-filled kind of line in the sand that basically said, let's make an agreement right here that we never run into each other again. You cross this line, and I'm not going to be responsible for what happens to you. If I cross that line, then I will know what I'm getting myself involved with. And so it was an oath of insult. It literally said, God watch over me. The word, or over you, the word Mizpah means to watch or to keep an eye on. So at this place where they, in 2 languages, said, because he was Syrian, let's make this a plan before God that God watch over both of us and literally keep us apart. May God watch you when I cannot, Jacob. And for Jacob, it was this parting, because it's the whole spiritual lesson, this division between the old life then and the new life that he's going to, verse 54. There's a cutting away, right? There's a moving forward. He's not there yet, but he's coming along. We read in verse, where are we at here? Verse 49? 48? Okay. Verse 48. This heap is a witness between us and between me and you this day. Therefore, the name shall be Gilead, that's witness, and Mizpah, watch, because he said, may the Lord watch between me and you when we are absent one from another. If you afflict my daughters, or if you take other wives beside my daughters, although no man is with you, see, God is witness between you and me. And Laban said to Jacob, here is this heap, here is this pillar, which I have placed between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar a witness, that I shall not pass beyond this heap to you. You shall not pass beyond this heap to me, and because of you there will be harm. And so the God of Jacob, the God of Nahor, with the God of their fathers, judged between us. And Jacob swore by the fear of his father, Isaac. Now, interesting picture here. Jacob refers to the Lord as the fear of my father Isaac. He does it in verse 42 and in verse 53 as well, which tells me that he believed when he left that his father had a relationship with the Lord, but it was one of fear, which is exactly what we read a couple of chapters back. He obeyed. He realized he got caught. It made him deathly afraid. He wasn't a friend of God like Abraham, but he was someone that was willing to do what God said out of fear. Sometimes fear is a good motivator, You think about standing before the Lord one day, that could be fearful. Good to remember, though, because that's going to happen. So twice he calls the Lord by the title, the fear of my father Isaac. Well, then we'll end in verse 54 and 55. Then Jacob offered a sacrifice upon the mountain, called his brothers to eat bread. They ate bread and stayed all night there on the mountain. And early in the morning, Laban arose. He kissed his sons and daughters and blessed them. He departed and went home to his place. So with an offering to the Lord, followed by a good night's sleep, watching for trouble during the day, goodbye, Laban. Well, that went well. Could have got worse. Today is going to be a better day. Not really. Because as he turns around to leave, a scout, maybe someone that rode ahead, he's a big bunch of people, comes to say to Jacob, hey, we're looking ahead where we might camp and where food might be found, where water is. We ran into your brother Esau. And weirdly enough, he's coming to greet you with 400 guys. And Jacob just put up a deal behind him. I can't go that way. And I'm not sure I want to go that way. Well, that'll be next week's lesson. How do you determine whether you are led of the Lord? Let me remind you again. It should always start with a work in your heart. You might be the only one that feels that way. When the Lord led Debbie and I out here to start Morningstar back in 1985, there was literally no one around us that thought that was a good idea. No one. I was working at Downey Calvary. I was teaching Sunday night. We had 1,600 people coming. Why would you not want to move? And I went, well, the Lord just kind of stirred my heart. I don't know what to tell you. It's going to be hard, starting a home. You have to get a job. Whatever. We just got to go do what the Lord says. You couldn't have convinced us otherwise, but it was hard to convince anyone else. But if God does a work in your heart, you listen. And then you begin to look at the circumstances, see if God opens the right doors. You hear from the Lord. We had a gentleman in our home Bible study that was I can't call him a prophet, but he'd get words from the Lord that would just always seem right. He'd come and share with the Lord. I had a dream, and this is what the Lord showed me, and the things just kind of they backed up the truth. We could, that's right, and God began to speak to us, and eventually people came along, and God began to do work. So I think you need to have those 4 steps, though. Desire first, confirmation second. Let God speak to you in very clear ways, and then get people around you that will stand with you and see what God is doing. It's a good lesson from Jacob's life. But here's a guy, we'll leave him at 98 years old, heading in the right direction, acknowledging God's blessings, cutting himself off from the past, hungry to go to the right place, but still fearful enough to where it'll take him another 8 years to get there. Unfortunately, he's got a little bit more lies to tell first, even after his name has been changed from heel catcher to governed by God. Oh, he'll be governed by God, but not today. He'll have the name tag, just not the heart. That'll take some time. Father, thank you tonight as we continue our journey through your word, how powerful it is to just spend time, go through the lesson, Lord, look at just what you lay out before us, what we can know, what we don't need to know, apparently. That as we read through just the information that we have, and we ask your wisdom, Lord, we pray that you would burn into our hearts in the narrative story. As we stand in the story with these characters, we would learn to walk with you as you set before us lessons to learn. And maybe one of the greatest lessons for us, Lord, is how do we hear your voice? How do we know that you're leading us? May the things we looked at tonight remind us over and over of how you often in the scriptures direct your people one step at a time. And as we watch Jacob, he's done a lot of succeeding in his life in terms of prosperity and wealth and gain, but yet his heart isn't at rest. His association, even in his own family, is weak spiritually. There's not much evidence of any spiritual fruit, but we are seeing him begin to acknowledge, Lord, who you are. He begins to realize that you have kept him, and as you have promised, he feels a sense of loyalty to you, as he'd made a promise. Lord, if you'll do that, I'll serve you, and I'll come back to serve you. And he's headed in that direction, just like so often we make promises. God, you begin to show us who you are, And maybe we balk a lot and we hesitate, but Lord, certainly your desire, like Jacob, was to get us to that place of Bethel, back to the house of God, where Lord, you would be in charge of our lives. If you are far removed from the Lord tonight, it doesn't have to take all those years like it took Jacob. The Bible says that the Lord is near us, even in our mouths. God is ever present. If tonight you are far from the Lord, you can resolve that in 1 minute by turning your heart and your attention and your desire back to the Lord and telling him that you want to come home. And he'll open his arms, and like the prodigal father, he'll be out on he's been out on the mountains waiting for you. And he couldn't find anything more exciting and desirable than you coming home and surrendering your life to him again. So if you've been the Jacob, in the 500 miles from home, I hope that tonight you'll turn around and quickly run back into the arms of a God who loves you and has great plans for your life, who will accomplish his will anyway. But it is always more desirable when he accomplishes it in the hearts of those who have yielded themselves and can along the way enjoy the hand of God. So if you're far away tonight, would you come back to that relationship with the Lord that God wants to have with you? And you can talk to one of the pastors and let them pray with you tonight to just go home satisfied, surrendered, and resolved to not walk away anymore. God is waiting. He's ready if you are.